The issue here was whether there was a Security Council resolution. And in the absence of a clear Security Council resolution, you needed the support of the Guineas and the Cameroons of the world.
Well, 17 resolutions, starting with, well, actually 660, which was the initial reaction to Saddam.
That was the first.
That was the very first reaction to his flagrant breach of international law by invading Kuwait. Then we had, let's say, 17. It's about that. And the argument in Britain, the so-called second resolution, for me, for my judgment, was about politics, was not about law. Politics in this country.
And where do you think we're left at the end of all of this?
Well, in difficulty, I accept that. It's interesting, isn't it, that at the time, this time 5 years ago, some two-thirds of this country, by the opinion polls, were in favour of military action against Saddam Hussein's regime. Something of that order. Is that legitimacy? A majority sense of that? Perhaps. Legitimacy is not so precise as legality, so far as international law is precise, and we've discovered already it's fairly imprecise. Now there's a different view. Perhaps two-thirds are against the war. I think that's about it too, from the opinion polls. And so, you know, our colleague here on my left says it was illegal, as though, you know, judgment ex cathedra. I'm not sure about that at all.
Professor Taft, where do you think the case for international intervention has been left?
Well, I think we still do certainly have the two bases, the UN Security Council resolution and an act of self-defense when you're under attack. Those are solid. We do have to worry about that situation where one member vetoes a resolution where it is necessary to use force to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe, and that is I think, a situation to work on. You can either expand the view of self-defense, or you can find a basis in this emerging doctrine of humanitarian intervention. Those would be the two possibilities, I think. But I do want to make the point, though, that Philippe did say a couple of times, as if everybody agreed with him, that the invasion of Iraq, the use of force against Iraq in 2003 was unlawful. That was not our view. It has never been our view. We felt that it was lawful and authorized by the Security Council resolutions. I think it's very important to stress that.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you. This year there's a lot of speculation that Alistair Darling will get Gladstone's scruffy old budget box out of the attic. His problem is that the economy is not in much better shape than the box, so he's little room for anything dramatic. The speculation is that he'll go for so-called green taxes and incentives to encourage us to alter our behaviour. That sets Susan Watts wondering whether governments really could effect that sort of change.
Spring tides and gale-force winds sent our coasts into a chaotic frenzy this morning, with spectacular scenes as people braved the storms. All this in the week that the government delivers its promised green budget. Climate scientists say there's worse to come in the decades ahead. So will the government's green taxes be tough enough to cope? Critics are already lining up to say they won't.
At the moment, we're not even in the ballpark. And if you want to get a sense of what it would feel like, it's going to be more like an environmental war budget. You're looking at the need for a radical transition in the economy in the space of the next 7, 8, 9 years towards a path of real sustainability. The kind of cuts in emissions that means we're going to have to rethink our energy infrastructure, our transport infrastructure, how agriculture works, and there's as yet no sign that we're getting to grips with the scale of the problem.
So do today's green taxes actually work? One group of MPs has looked at the climate change levy, a tax that's supposed to make business go green. They found that left to its own devices, business won't do the right thing.
We find it surprising the extent to which business had not already invested in greater energy efficiency, something which it's in their own interest to do. And the conclusion we drew was that business, and this applies particularly to smaller businesses, need really clear carrot and stick incentives if they're going to move towards the low carbon choices which it's important they should make.
Air travel is a perfect illustration of the point. Businesses don't necessarily act in a rational way and minimise their fuel costs. But noise regulation is forcing airlines to bring in newer aeroplanes that just happen to be 20% more fuel efficient. An argument for regulation, perhaps.
So what do we think might be in Wednesday's budget? The expectation is that the budget will see changes to taxes on airlines, perhaps a tax per flight rather than per passenger, to encourage companies to fly fuller planes. Biofuels, though environmentally controversial, are expected to get a boost too. The Chancellor is also expected to keep his planned 2p a litre rise on fuel duty, and he may introduce a so-called showroom tax, hitting gas-guzzling 4x4s by making them more expensive to buy as well as to run. The trouble is that no one's ever very clear about what green taxes are for, whether they're supposed to raise money or to make people change their behaviour. Perhaps they'll only really have a point if they're hypothecated. That's economists speak for ring-fencing the money a tax raises.
The congestion charge set a precedent. It's a hypothecated tax. That means the money it raises goes straight into public transport. Now, if gas guzzlers really are going to be hit in this week's budget, perhaps drivers would be more prepared to stomach that green tax if they could see an environmental benefit, rather than the money going straight into Treasury's coffers.
It's a matter of Treasury theology, and always has been. The Treasury love the power that they have to control what happens to the money that's raised in taxation. They are very reluctant to give that power up. I think that's a pity. I think the urgency of the climate change threat is so great. We need far more green taxes than we now have. And I think one way in which they could be introduced is if the Treasury was willing to allow some hypothecation.
Another big problem is that many green taxes are regressive. They hit the poorest people hardest. There's no clear way round that at the moment, only proposals. And the government has yet to come out on one possible solution that's gaining support.
If we move to a system of tradable personal carbon allowances, so every citizen would have a certain amount of carbon emissions that they could have free of charge. If they then decided not to heat their house to 25 degrees in the winter, not to have a swimming pool or air conditioning, perhaps lived in a slightly smaller house, they would then find they came in under their carbon budget. They would have something which they could sell. So in that way, you'd have a form of green taxation which was progressive rather than regressive. And those people who lived rich, extravagant lifestyles would pay more tax. Those who were willing to live more in a more green way would actually benefit. They'd have some extra income.
But the Treasury may find any newfound green credentials soon go up in smoke. Another part of government, the business department, is weighing up whether to say yes to new coal-fired power stations like that proposed for Kingsnorth in Kent. There's talk of a fierce tug-of-war in Whitehall, and some saw as ominous a ministerial speech today that fossil fuels like coal, made as clean as they can be, do have a place in Britain's future energy mix.
We're told time and again of the need for joined-up government. Now, to have a budget making some green announcements at the same time that it looks that we might be embarking on a whole new range of coal-fired power stations is ridiculous. It's like promising peace and preparing for war. And if there are such fundamental contradictions in government policy, nobody will take the Treasury seriously.
The government's already had to acknowledge that worsening forecasts on climate change may mean cutting greenhouse emissions by 80% by the middle of the century. They've got no hope of convincing people they're up to the task if the budget isn't as green as billed. And it may be too much to expect that just tweaking the budget could ever deliver a low-carbon future.
Well, with us in the studio now, Sian Berry, who's the Green Party's London mayoral election candidate, Stephen Hale of the Green Alliance, and joining us from Westminster, the former Chancellor, Kenneth Clarke. You've had some involvement in green taxes in the past, Kenneth Clarke. Are they any different to any other taxes?
They can be, but I did have some. The landfill tax I introduced to stop waste being disposed of in landfill, and we did allow that to be hypothecated. You didn't have to pay the Treasury as long as you paid it on environmental schemes. I introduced the fuel escalator. Part of the argument for which was to make people more careful about using fuel, so I put the duty up there, and I introduced the air passenger tax. But I do not go along with the idea that the tax system is remotely suitable for transforming the nature of our economy and economic production.
OK, we'll come to some of the broader philosophical points in a moment. Sian Berry, why do you believe it's legitimate to use fiscal measures to change behaviour?
Well, I think, I mean, in the absence of the personal carbon quotas that were talked about, the way to move towards something better than that is hypothecated green taxes. But they have to be done with the aim of changing people's behaviour.
So the function of the tax,
to raise money.
the function of the tax is to change behaviour. It is not to raise revenue.
It has to be designed in the way that will change behaviour
the
most,
not
what will raise the most money.
Then you raise no money from it.
That's the idea, yeah. There's no point in charging £25 for a gas guzzler.
How does that work for you?
Well, I think actually it's got to do both those things. We've got to shift the tax system dramatically because companies don't change their behaviour just because a politician makes a speech saying they'd rather they did X rather than Y, and people don't change their transport patterns just because they read a brilliant speech by the Chancellor saying, well, it really would be better if you got a tram or a bus. They respond to price signals. Companies do and people do.